When white faces the queen's gambit declined, an interesting option is to play an early c takes d5. We're going to examine the queen's gambit declined exchange variation and also introduce the Tarrasch and Semi-Tarrasch defenses. We have a lot of interesting and instructive positions to examine, so let's get started. We reach the queen's gambit after d4, d5. Both sides claim a fair share of the center. The most ambitious and challenging line for white is to turn the game into the queen's gambit with c4, placing immediate pressure against black's center with the positional threat of c takes d5, when white will be able to prepare e4, taking over the center. D takes c4, known as the queen's gambit accepted, is a respectable option if black is well prepared. Instead of capturing the c4 pawn, black can reinforce the center with e6, turning the game into the queen's gambit declined. Black defends the important d5 pawn, preparing to respond to c takes d5 with e takes d5, maintaining a healthy pawn center. One drawback to this solid move is that it restricts the mobility of the light-squared bishop, so black will need to figure out how to effectively bring this piece into the game. White continues with the sensible developing move knight c3. Adding more pressure against the d5 pawn, black's most natural continuation is to respond in kind with knight f6, developing a piece and adding protection to the d5 square. White has several choices at this point, including the direct bishop g5, playing knight f3, as well as the move we'll study today, c takes d5. After black responds with e takes d5, at first glance, white's decision to capture on d5 looks like a strategic mistake. After all, we just mentioned that black's biggest challenge in the queen's gambit declined is activating the light-squared bishop. And thanks to white's pawn capture, the light-squared bishop's main diagonal has been opened. Things are far from simple, and as we'll see, it isn't so easy to find an ideal moment to activate this piece. White has transformed the pawn structure into the Carlsbad structure, a famous pawn structure that can be reached from a variety of openings. White has given black a 4 versus 3 pawn majority on the queen side, while white has a 4 versus 3 pawn majority on the king side. The capture c takes d5 has opened up the c-file for white's pieces, and in exchange, black now enjoys open lines on the e-file. The Carlsbad structure is a positionally rich pawn structure that will reward careful study. You can find multiple courses right here on chess.com which will cover this theme, but for the purposes of our opening study, we need to briefly examine a basic position to better understand what white is trying to achieve. You're going to become quite familiar with this pawn structure as we'll see it throughout this video. In this classic Carlsbad structure, one of white's plans is to execute a minority attack on the queen side. The basic idea behind the minority attack is to attack black's queenside pawn majority with the aim of creating weaknesses in black's pawn structure. The minority attack in its simplest form involves playing b4. This pawn advance is often supported by a rook on b1. Black's pawn on c6 is a target which white prepares to attack with a4 and b5. To appreciate white's plan, let's make some random and not particularly good moves for black. White continues with the minority attack by playing a4. White's a and b pawns work together to attack black's pawn majority with b5. After black plays another move, let's say king g8, white's minority attack invades black's position with b5. White's point is that no matter how black reacts, a weakness will be created in black's pawn structure. If black does nothing, white will play b takes c6, when after b takes c6, not only does black have an isolated a pawn, the c6 pawn is now a backward pawn, which can be attacked by white's pieces on the c-file. And in many cases, white will have a knight on f3, so knight e5 can continue to add pressure against this weakness. If black captures the pawn with c takes b5, this isolates the d5 pawn, which means black will have to protect this pawn with pieces and will be a target for white to attack, not to mention opening up the a file after a takes b5. So if black still has a pawn on a7, this will be another target for white to attack. Finally, if black advances the pawn with c5, assuming that black's other pieces are protecting it, white can simply play d takes c5. Once again, this isolates the d pawn, and by opening up the d file, this will help white add additional pressure to the d5 pawn. Of course, this is only a simplified explanation of a positionally complex structure, but it will help guide our understanding when we see the minority attack in action. Now that we've reached the exchange variation, white usually continues with developing the dark squared bishop. Since bishop f4 allows bishop d6, allowing black easy development, white usually pins the knight with bishop g5. If black tries to liberate the light squared bishop with bishop f5, we can see finding a proper time to bring this light squared bishop into the action isn't so simple. White has the strong response bishop takes f6. Queen takes f6 loses a pawn to knight takes d5. And after g takes f6, not only is black's pawn structure compromised, white can now take advantage of the premature development of black's light squared bishop with queen b3, double attacking the d5 and b7 pawns when black is in serious trouble. Instead of bishop f5, black often plays bishop e7, unpinning the knight and preparing to castle. Another option to consider is immediately playing c6, reinforcing d5, so bishop f5 becomes a more realistic possibility. If white wants to discourage an immediate bishop f5, then queen c2 can be played, often transposing into the main lines we are about to examine. White's most straightforward continuation is e3. Now that the dark squared bishop is outside of the pawn chain, e3 is a positive move which reinforces the center and opens up a diagonal for the light squared bishop. Black now has an important decision to make. If black wants to develop the light squared bishop, it's now possible to play bishop f5. White is willing to allow black's light squared bishop to develop, but only at a price after queen f3. This strange-looking queen move forces black to compromise the kingside pawn structure. Once the bishop moves to safety with bishop g6, white is ready to play bishop takes f6. When black enters a queenless middle game with queen takes f6, queen takes f6, and g takes f6, black accepts isolated, doubled f-pawns in exchange for the bishop pair. Trading queens so early in the game and accepting the inferior pawn structure may not be to everyone's taste, especially when black may need to defend a somewhat unpleasant endgame. That being said, a close study of modern grandmaster games can reveal this is a strategically rich position filled with imbalances, so the interested viewer is encouraged to dig beneath the surface and explore the hidden subtleties in the position. If black would prefer to avoid the simplifications after bishop f5, then a straightforward response is bishop e7. Now that black's bishop protects the f6 knight, bishop f5 is a positional threat. For example, if white simply plays knight f3, this encourages black to play bishop f5, activating the light squared bishop and ready to exchange bishops if white plays bishop d3. In general, when black can safely play bishop f5 without making any serious concessions, then black shouldn't experience any serious difficulties out of the opening. Since black is ready to solve the problem of the light squared bishop with bishop f5, white typically responds with queen c2, or immediately developing the bishop with bishop d3. The bishop enjoys an active post, preventing black's desirable bishop f5 idea. Black typically continues to develop with knight b to d7, helping support the other knight as well as the center, and as we'll see, it often will complete an instructive maneuver to the king side. White's most flexible continuation is queen c2, creating a queen-bishop battery on the b1 to h7 diagonal, as well as placing the queen on the c-file, where it may later add pressure against black's queen side. We are going to focus on Black's most traditional continuation, castling the king. But it's worth noting that another interesting plan for Black is to immediately play h6, with the idea that after bishop h4, Black will play knight h5, forcing the trade of dark squared bishops. This means Black is often seeking to trade both bishops, eliminating White's most active pieces and trying to unwind from a slightly cramped game. Now let's explore the positions after Black castles. White has remained flexible, but must now decide upon a plan. The first decision is how to develop the knight on g1. Both knight f3 and knight g to e2 are important ideas, when White will then have to decide where to castle the king. Let's first take a look at the straightforward plan of knight f3. Developing the knight to its most natural square. When White plays knight f3, this often signals a plan for a minority attack with rook b1, b4, and b5. One attraction to Black's setup is that you can rely on similar moves against most of White's ideas. Black is ready to play rook e8, centralizing the rook and preparing to support action in the center, especially knight e4. By moving the rook to e8, this also allows Black to complete the kingside knight maneuver with knight f8. Although White sometimes castles queenside, the most common idea is to continue with the minority attack by first castling on the king side. When Black continues with knight f8, the knight clears the diagonal for Black's light-squared bishop. By protecting the h7 square, this allows the possibility of playing a move such as knight g4, offering a trade of dark-squared bishops. Black may also consider a future bishop g4, attacking the knight on f3. Although White sometimes continues with rook a to b1, a popular option for White is to first play h3, restricting Black's pieces from using the g4 square. h3 also has the additional benefit of allowing White to play bishop f4, and if needed, bishop h2, trying to avoid an exchange of dark-squared bishops. Against h3, Black has tried a variety of moves worth examining, including the direct knight e4, knight h5, both offering a trade of dark-squared bishops. Knight g6 is also a sensible choice, but an instructive idea worth keeping in mind is g6. This move initiates an interesting plan involving the trade of light-squared bishops with a well-timed bishop f5. One idea for Black is to play knight h5, offering a trade of dark-squared bishops, followed by knight g7, which then prepares bishop f5, offering a favorable trade of light-squared bishops. In one high-level game, Grandmaster Wesley So tried to prevent an exchange of dark-squared bishops with bishop f4, moving to a different diagonal than Black's dark-squared bishop. His opponent, Grandmaster Heracek, centralized the knight with knight e6, threatening to capture White's dark-squared bishop. So after bishop h2, Black played knight g7. It's not every day that you see a knight on g7, but this actually makes perfect strategic sense, as it prepares to exchange light-squared bishops with bishop f5. Grandmaster So prepared the minority attack with rook a to b1, preparing the pawn thrust b4 to b5. When you're facing the minority attack, it can be useful to slow it down by first playing a5, discouraging b4 and taking space on the queen side. After both sides continued with their respective plans with a3, preparing b4, and bishop f5, developing the last minor piece and preparing to exchange light-squared bishops, White played b4. Although playing a5 weakens the b6 square, which White may later be able to use to add pressure against Black's queenside, a positive aspect of a5 is that after a takes b4, Black has activated the rook on the a-file, which may later create active counterplay. This is exactly what happened after bishop takes d3, queen takes d3. Black has achieved a favorable exchange of light-squared bishops, And after attracting the queen to the third rank, black played rook a3, pinning the knight to white's queen. White sensibly moved the queen to a safer square with queen c2. White is ready to continue the minority attack with b5, followed by creating a backward c6 pawn after b takes c6. In the game, black allowed white to create that structure after first trading dark squared bishops with bishop d6. White was able to build some pressure against black's weakened queenside, although black ultimately was able to hold the draw. Instead of allowing this gradual pressure after b5 and b takes c6, black can also consider the double-edged decision to immediately play b5. This cements white's pawn on b4, making it a long-term target for black's pieces. Playing b5 comes at the price of once again weakening c6, creating a backward c6 pawn. The point is that after white plays the natural knight e5, improving the position of the knight and adding pressure against c6, black can respond with queen a8, protecting the c6 pawn, as well as creating a queen-rook battery on the a file. By moving the queen, this also allows black to consider playing rook c8, adding more protection to the weakened c6 pawn, especially as white will likely consider rook f to c1, preparing to add more pressure against the c6 pawn as the positional struggle intensifies. This is just one of many ways the minority attack can play out. White often succeeds in creating queenside weaknesses in black's position, but as we can see, black is not without resources as well. Instead of knight f3, white can decide to develop the knight to e2. White can still play for the minority attack plan, but moving the knight to e2 often signals white will play more aggressively in the center with f3 and e4, or else decide to castle queenside and prepare a kingside attack. Once again, black can rely on the same setup with rook e8. White is now at a crossroads, needing to decide where to castle the king. Let's first take a look at kingside castling. By castling kingside, white is usually preparing central expansion with f3 and e4. After black continues with knight f8, white's most ambitious as well as dangerous plan is to play f3. This is a sharp idea, preparing to play e4 without accepting an isolated queen's pawn in the process. Former world champion Garry Kasparov won a number of nice games as white, achieving a well-timed e3 to e4 pawn advance, so his games are definitely good models to study. Black has tried a variety of moves including bishop e6, g6, and even knight h5 to encourage a trade of dark squared bishops. Another interesting idea is to play knight g6. The knight returns to the action, eyeing sensitive dark squares in white's territory, especially f4 if white plays a quick e4. The knight also limits the scope of white's queen-bishop battery pointing at black's castled kingside. White can continue patiently building the central pressure with rook a to d1, when black may respond by developing and supporting the center with bishop e6, a position that merits additional study. If white decides to play a quick e4, white expands in the center, but this is a double-edged decision as black is able to highlight some downsides to this move after the central exchange d takes e4, f takes e4. White's center can look intimidating, but this was accomplished at the price of weakening some dark squares, so black can play the instructive move, knight g4, offering a trade of dark squared bishops. And if white does not accept this trade, then black can soften white's dark squares with the central counterstrike, c5. After bishop takes e7, an interesting idea for black is to capture the bishop with the rook. This capture will help build pressure against white's center with a future rook d7. White needs to respond to black's threat of knight e3, so after the sensible reply queen d2, the light-squared bishop is eager to enter the action, so black can play bishop e6, centralizing the bishop with a reasonable position. White can still consider playing a solid centralizing move such as rook a to d1, But if white decides to attack the knight with h3, instead of knight f6, black has the surprising response knight 4 to e5, attacking white's light-squared bishop, as well as eyeing the c4 square. The tactical justification behind this strong move is if white captures the knight, then black can respond with knight takes e5, adding pressure against the pinned bishop. So after rook a to d1, the value of the rook on e7 is realized with rook d7, piling up even more pressure against the pinned bishop when black is ready to play bishop c4 if necessary to regain the piece with a favorable position. Instead of castling kingside, white can decide to sharpen the game by castling queenside. White's decision basically forces both players to attack the enemy king on opposite wings. White will prepare a pawn storm on the king side, possibly with h3, g4, followed by knight g3 and knight f5. Another idea for white is to play h4, with the idea of playing f3 and g4 to grab more space on the king side and accelerate the pawn storm. Black, of course, should not sit by idly and watch white attack the king. Black can respond with a queenside pawn storm with b5, a5, and a4. Since white has a powerful queen-bishop battery pointing directly at black's king, another idea is to grab space with a5, and instead of playing b5, black can play b6, preparing to exchange white's dangerous light-squared bishop with bishop a6. Both sides can expect sharp, double-edged play in this exciting position. If black wants to avoid the main lines that follow e takes d5 and bishop g5, black can consider playing the semi-Tarrasch with knight takes d5. This provocative move allows white to gain a large center with e4, when black's idea is to counterattack that center after knight takes c3, b takes c3, and c5, adding pressure against the d4 pawn. If white wants to avoid the simplifications which will soon follow, then a3 and rook b1 are interesting alternatives to consider. After the traditional knight f3, black has willingly accepted a space disadvantage, but black's idea is to ease some of these problems by trading another pair of minor pieces with c takes d4. C takes d4. By eliminating white's backward c-pawn, black is able to play bishop b4 check. When after bishop d2, bishop takes d2 check, and queen takes d2, black has traded another pair of minor pieces, allowing black to castle the king. White has a variety of choices, including bishop d3, as well as playing bishop c4. At a favorable moment, white may try to create a passed pawn with d4 to d5. A typical response from black is to play knight d7. The knight remains flexible, preparing to move to f6 and support the king if necessary. Black intends to complete development with b6 and bishop b7. White will often castle and centralize the rooks on the d and e files. White enjoys more space with the potential to create a dangerous passed d-pawn, but black does have a solid position and will continue to apply pressure against white's center to fight for counterplay. Overall, the Semi-Tarrasch is considered a somewhat passive, but generally reliable defensive system for black. Instead of playing knight f6 on the third move, another interesting option to keep in mind is bishop e7. This natural developing move prevents white from playing bishop g5, so white cannot enter the exchange variation c takes d5 with a quick bishop g5 in mind. If white decides to play knight f3, this reveals that bishop e7 is a waiting move, so after white plays knight f3, black is now ready to play knight f6. White can play traditional lines such as bishop f4 or bishop g5, but if white plays c takes d5, this transposes into an exchange variation with an early knight f3, which we have already seen as a less flexible and less promising option for white. Instead of knight f3, white can remain consistent with the Carlsbad structure and play c takes d5. When after e takes d5, unlike the other variations we have examined, white cannot play the direct bishop g5 idea. White's most popular option is to activate the dark squared bishop with bishop f4. Knight f6 is certainly a natural choice which can be explored, but black often focuses on liberating the light squared bishop by first playing the familiar c6, securing the center, and preparing bishop f5. White can try to discourage black from playing bishop f5 with queen c2, but a dynamic option is to actually encourage black to play bishop f5 with the simple e3, reinforcing the center with the idea of meeting bishop f5 with the ambitious g4, gaining a tempo against the bishop as white grabs space, building an initiative on the king side. For the interested viewer wanting to learn more about black's defensive resources, grandmaster attention is shifted to the solid bishop e6, when white typically reinforces the g4 pawn with h3, or continues to expand on the king side with h4. With proper study, black does not have to fear this line. But if black plays the natural-looking bishop g6, white is able to create some problems for black with h4, threatening to trap the bishop with h5. If black responds with h5, then white can play g5, and if black plays h6, then white can play h5, gaining another tempo against the bishop with a promising position. After white plays h4, you may wonder why black can't simply capture the h-pawn with bishop takes h4. This natural-looking capture is immediately punished with queen b3, attacking the b7 pawn. Black's queen is unable to protect both the dark squared bishop and b7 pawn at the same time, as a move such as queen e7 falls to rook takes h4. If black tries to defend the b7 pawn with b6, this also falls to the tactical shot rook takes h4. When after queen takes h4, now that black's queen has vacated the queen side, white can play the crushing knight takes d5, threatening the fork knight c7 check, and if black captures the knight with c takes d5, black's position falls apart after bishop b5 check. If the king moves out of the way, then white will play queen takes d5, and if black plays knight d7, white simply captures the knight, since king takes d7 allows the crushing queen takes d5 check. Instead of following the typical safety-first strategy of the Queen's Gambit declined, black can seek immediate activity with the more risky c5, turning the game into the Tarrasch Defense. White's most direct response is the familiar c takes d5. When after e takes d5, white has cemented a black pawn on d5, which will often become a central target, especially as it will likely become an isolated pawn. Play typically continues with knight f3, reinforcing the d4 pawn, when black increases pressure against it with knight c6. Modern grandmaster attention has started to explore d takes c5 immediately, but the traditional plan for white is the Rubinstein variation with g3. White intends to fianchetto the bishop, adding more pressure against the d5 pawn. After knight f6 and bishop g2, black continues to develop with bishop e7. When both sides typically castle, once again, d takes c5 is an interesting idea to explore, immediately creating an isolated pawn on d5. White's classical response has been the straightforward bishop g5, adding pressure against the knight, which is a key defender of the d5 pawn. In recent years, black has started to play the interesting c4, relieving the tension in the center and gaining space on the queen side, with sharp play to follow. That being said, black's traditional response has been c takes d4, accepting an isolated pawn after knight takes d4, blockading black's isolated d5 pawn and revealing the light squared bishop's pressure against it. At this point, black often puts the question to white's bishop with h6. The point is, if white plays bishop takes f6, this actually doesn't win a pawn because black can play bishop takes f6. counterattacking white's knight on d4. So white typically responds with bishop e3, reinforcing the knight on d4. In this variation of the Tarrasch, it's important for black to generate counterplay using the e-file with rook e8. After white's most popular continuation, rook c1, black sometimes plays bishop g4, but a more common continuation is bishop f8. Black increases pressure down the e-file. The rook on e8 also supports a future knight e4. White has several interesting options to consider, including queen b3, adding pressure against black's d5 pawn, as well as queen a4, adding pressure against the knight on c6. And for the interested viewer, you can explore the positions after knight takes c6, b takes c6, creating hanging pawns for black. White's idea is to play knight a4, revealing pressure against the backward c6 pawn and preparing to blockade the squares in front of the hanging pawns. The Tarrasch defense is more strategically risky than most of the other lines in the Queen's Gambit declined, but it does have its loyal defenders and is certainly not an opening you should underestimate. In the Queen's Gambit declined, c takes d5 is a serious positional option to consider. The most popular variation we studied is the exchange variation, leading to the instructive Carlsbad pawn structure with strategically rich play for both sides. We also were introduced to the Tarrasch and Semi-Tarrasch openings, which may share a similar name, but are completely different in nature. Although these two openings are less popular than the exchange variation, they are relevant, respectable openings that need to be taken seriously. Thanks for exploring these important openings, and perhaps you'll include the capture c takes d5 in your own repertoire, feel more confident when facing this capture, or possibly you'll explore these positions with both colors. In any case, best of luck during your future adventures.